The 5 conservative members of the Supreme Court appear poised to allow the Trump administration to add a controversial question on citizenship to the 2020 census. It's controversial partly because, as Justice Sonia Sotomayor said during today's oral arguments, quote, "There's no doubt that people will respond less because of the census. That has been proven in study after study. The people who respond less to that question are non-citizens. And when people respond less, it skews things like congressional representation and federal funding for the next decade." And the question is this: is suppressing that response from immigrants the very reason that Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross added the question to begin with? Ross claimed that the Department of Justice asked him to include the question. But as the Washington Post reports, emails and depositions in the lawsuit showed Ross had discussed the issue with White House officials urging a crackdown on undocumented immigrants. Some showed that he initiated contact with the Justice Department officials, not the other way around. For some reason, Chief Justice John Roberts and the other conservative justices seemed to move past why 3 federal district court judges had banned the Trump Commerce Department from adding the question and seized on a pretty shocking and cynical justification to keep it. Reuters reports, quote, Roberts told New York Solicitor General Barbara Underwood, whose state sued to block the question, that citizenship data is critical for enforcing the Voting Rights Act. You'll recall that in 2013, Roberts voted to gut a key portion of the Voting Rights Act, calling it unnecessary to pre-clear southern states because racism is over. And as Ari Berman wrote in 2015, John Roberts' legal career has been a decades-long crusade against the Voting Rights Act. So the idea that he would invoke it as a reason to twist the census to Donald Trump's anti-immigration aims is interesting. And if the Supreme Court does allow the citizenship question to remain, there's little question that the voting rights of many Americans will be undermined. Joining me now are 2 people who were at the oral arguments today. Dale Ho, director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project, who argued against adding the citizen question in front of the Supreme Court today, and Vanita Gupta, president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and former head of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Thank you both for being here. And Dale, I'll start with you. How surprising was it to hear John Roberts voice the idea that the reason to add a citizenship question was to strengthen the Voting Rights Act?
Well, it wasn't all that surprising. The government has been saying from the beginning that that's the reason why they added this question. But as you noted, they were intent on adding it long before anyone ever suggested the idea that it might be helpful for purposes of the Voting Rights Act. And let's be real for a second here. The Voting Rights Act is not a priority of this administration. They haven't brought a single lawsuit to enforce the Voting Rights Act. So the notion that they wanted to change the census to help enforce voting rights is really ludicrous.
Yeah, and you also, in your oral argument, hit back at their claim that they wanted to do this because it makes things more accurate. Please explain.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, when he said we needed to add this question, he said that it wouldn't harm census responses. That was false. The Census Bureau predicted that 6.5 million people won't respond to the census. And what that means is the data is less accurate. So when they say that, oh, we need this data for the Voting Rights Act, well, you're going to have a much less accurate census when 6.5 million people don't respond to it. It's going to harm efforts to protect voting rights rather than help them.
Yeah, and Vanita, let me just read you a little bit from a Washington Post piece today that talks about the potential undercount should this citizenship question be added. Experts calculated that adding the question could mean an undercount of as many as 6.5 million people and cause special harm to urban areas and states with large immigrant populations. California, for instance, worried it could lose as many as 3 congressional seats. Do you suspect that that's what this is about, stripping congressional seats and representation from blue states with large immigrant populations?
Yeah, I do. I think that, first of all, I want to say that Dale did a phenomenal job this morning in the Supreme Court. But the nefarious agenda behind the addition of this question has really been revealed through the litigation that led up to the Supreme Court argument today. You know, there's little hiding the fact that Wilbur Ross was communicating with Steve Bannon and Chris Kobach in the early days of the administration to add this question and this back-end rationale, allegedly that the Trump Justice Department under Jeff Sessions needed the census citizenship data in order to robustly enforce the Voting Rights Act was so blatantly a ruse. But the underlying thing, look, every aspect of this administration has been virulently anti-immigrant, and the Steve Bannon and Chris Kobachs of the world want to change how redistricting happens and how district and reapportionment happens. They want only citizens to be counted in that process. And the census, though, is written into the Constitution. The Constitution makes very clear that the federal government has a duty every 10 years to count every single person in this country. Not every citizen in this country, but every single person in this country. And the fact that study after study shows that the addition of this question is going to undermine the accuracy of the count, and yet that justices seemed, and even the Justice Department is conceding that fact, is actually kind of striking and is a signal of where we are today around the politicization of these issues and of core tenets of our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes without saying that when the Constitution was written, the enslaved African African population were not considered citizens. They were 3/4 of a person. They weren't even considered people. Dale Ho, is there any recourse? Let's say this goes through, because I think the pessimistic out there believe that the 5 conservatives are going to allow the Trump administration to add a citizenship question. What then?
Well, I just want to hold things up on that prognostication here, because people who try to read the tea leaves of the Supreme Court are frequently wrong. And some people thought the Affordable Care Act would get struck down, and that didn't happen. And I just think it's a little early to say something like that. The evidence in this case is really strong that adding this question is going to wreck the census, which is a pillar of our constitutional structure. And I have to think that if the justices care about the evidence, they're going to listen to that. Now, as you know, we might not win, right? That's the case every time we go in front of the Supreme Court. And what we have to do is just double down on our efforts to make sure that everyone gets counted. You hear sometimes people talking about how, well, we just might not respond to the census if this question's on there. That is the worst thing that we can do right now, because that's exactly what Steve Bannon and Chris Kobach want. They want an undercount of communities of color. They want our communities to receive fewer political representatives and less resources, and we can't let them win.
Wow, what a day. Dale Ho, Vanita Gupta, thank you both very much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.